Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our moderator, Chief Economics Commentator, The Wall Street Journal, Greg Ip, and his distinguished panel.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I can't think of a more important year to be discussing this topic on the dangers of debt. We have a terrific panel to have a conversation about that today, starting with my left, Simon Johnson, from the economist at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, former chief economist at the IMF. To his left, Deanna Mulligan, chief executive officer of Guardian Life Insurance. It's a mutually owned company, so you can't trade their stock, but they are, I'm told, one of the largest, a Fortune 250 company. And to her left, Steve Ratner, who many of you know from his columns in the New York Times, his appearances on Morning Joe, his long and storied experience in government. I'd like to start with you, Steve, actually, by pointing out that this is, as you all know, the 9th fiscal summit. And for the last 8 summits, we've been warning everybody about the dangers of debt. You know, what is different this year compared to the other 8 years? Is it any more dangerous than usual?
Well, yes, I think it's more dangerous than usual because we are going into trillion-dollar deficits at the tail end of, maybe not, hopefully not the tail end, but the late stages of a recovery cycle. And what's also unusual this time is that when you look at estimates that are done by nonpartisan estimators, the CBO, the CRFB, whoever you choose to look at, you see that instead of what at least I historically remember usually being true, which was that the out-year projection showed the deficit eventually coming down, even though often it never did. In this case, you're looking at trillion-dollar deficits literally as far as the eye can see. And so I think all of that paints a fairly ugly picture. I don't know if you want me to talk about the markets a little bit now, or
sure, yeah. Why don't you? Yeah.
Because I thought that's where we were starting, but you fooled me. Look, I mean, the question I think I often get asked is, when are the markets going to react to this and understand this level of debt? And I think I worry about 2 things. I worry about the possibility that the markets will react to this and we'll have a credit crisis of some sort. And I worry about the possibility the markets won't react to this and will simply go on for the next 10 years without the markets ever revolting, so to speak. I think the reason at the moment the markets have been quite sanguine is because the world is awash in capital, as we all know. And particularly, we are running, as we also all know, and on this point, the president, at least I think, is directionally pointing out something worth noting, a huge current account deficit. And the result is we're sucking in enormous amounts of capital that effectively are financing our deficit. And so you have this savings surplus around the world. You have downward pressure relative to where they should be at this point in the cycle. And so really not much effect. On the flip side, you could imagine this going on for a long time. I saw a study recently, Simon would certainly know more about this, by a macroeconomist that basically said that it's possible to believe that even all this extra debt would only add 20 basis points to long-term interest rates over the next 10 years. And if that's what happens, then it's very possible we could actually get through this period without the credit markets revolting. And as I said, that's almost as bad as if they do revolt.
Deanna, how about you? I mean, your company's in the markets all the time. You have a very large investment portfolio that has to be invested for the long term. Do you see anything out there to worry about? Do you think that point could be coming?
Well, as you said, we invest for the very long term because we have long-term obligations to our policyholders. And we're looking 10, 12, 15 years out. And as Steve said, we kind of have to balance what might happen next week, next year, but we think a lot about where things might be 10 years from now. And so we too see that there is a possibility that the debt markets might not recognize this in the short term, and a lot of pressure could build up for the long term. So we really do take that into account when we're thinking about what the future is going to be for us.
Simon, what about you? Do you think that we should be worried about something happening in the financial markets soon because of our debt?
Well, I think we should certainly worry, Greg. I mean, as Steve said, we're near full employment. We're running a pro-cyclical fiscal policy, so we're having a fiscal expansion when almost all other industrial countries are actually on a path to reducing their debt to GDP. We're increasing our debt to GDP. And increasingly, frankly, our fate is not in our hands, because whether there is an impact on bond markets, for example, depends on whether other countries around the world choose to run a current account surplus and invest overall and net those proceeds in our US government debt. If they do, if we have big surpluses, and the official forecasts, they're really very sanguine, say that those surpluses will be increasingly coming from Europe, not from Asia and not from the oil exporters. So we'll see if that's right. But if people are willing to invest that capital and give us another free ride, that is to our short-term advantage. Of course, we are just, as both my colleagues just said, storing up bigger problems for the medium term.
You of course had a lot of experience working with emerging markets in your days at the fund, and I remember you had a column last fall, pointing to Peronist Argentina in the 1940s as a cautionary tale. And coincidentally, Argentina is back in the headlines. They are back at the IMF looking for money. Is that the relevant experience that the United States needs to be worrying about? And if not, what is the relevant model we need to worry about?
Well, the US is obviously a unique, special country and not like Argentina. However, if you think about a couple of moments in recent US history that have some validity and are a bit of a worry, 2002, 2003, for example, deficits start to increase and the people running the country take the view that debt and deficits don't matter. I think that was regrettable. Also, I would ask people to go away and look up 1967, 1968, when the economy was running hot. The Johnson administration was running a rather aggressive expansionary fiscal policy, partly related to Vietnam. People thought they could have guns and butter. And very soon afterwards, not in the first 6 months, 12 months, but very soon afterwards, we had inflation, we had all kinds of other problems, and we had the 1970s that absolutely came out of overly expansionary fiscal policy from the late 1960s.
But this morning we got inflation numbers. They were actually on the soft side. Bond yields, we were debating whether they were actually up or down today, but they seem to be very well controlled. So I sort of return to this question. We've been told over and over again at events such as this and elsewhere that we need to worry about this, but the markets are not worried, and maybe we're worrying about the wrong thing. Deanna, what do you think?
Well, I think one thing we have to think about is how are we spending our money as a country? And as the deficit rises, we're spending more and more on the interest rate payments we have to make to support it. And as a business person, I worry that that spending is crowding out productive government spending, because if you think about our GDP in simple terms, it's number of people times productivity of people. And as we seem to be heading toward policies that restrict immigration, we have to make people more productive if we want GDP to grow. There needs to be a lot of investment in education and building up our labor force. And the more we spend on debt service, the less we can spend as a government on those kinds of things.
Well, so as you know, and I'll sticking with you for a moment, Deanna, we had a very large tax reform package. And depending on who you believe, that will add either $1 to $2 trillion to our debt over the coming decade. Was that a wise use of $1 to $2 trillion of borrowing?
Well, I would say that the corporate tax rates needed to be made more competitive with global tax rates. So I think there's a fairly broad view that making business more competitive is a good thing for all Americans, because even though not all Americans own stock in public companies, many jobs are created by public companies. So I think having a corporate, public and private companies, so I think having a corporate tax rate that's competitive globally is an important thing. However, I do think that another impact of that people don't think about as much is as companies can retain more of their earnings, what do they do with them? And one of the things we have publicly said we are doing with the savings from the tax cuts is we are investing in our workforce. We're doing a lot of workforce training. We're doing automation, which will make our company more productive, but at the same time, we're investing in training our people so they can keep up with that automation. And I don't think I'm alone in CEOs that I'm talking to who are really right now investing in the workforce. And if private companies can do enough that the workforce keeps up, that's great. It might be helpful if government could do a little bit more of that and would have the capacity in the future to do that.
What about you, Steve? What bothers you more? Is it the size of the deficit we've incurred or the uses to which that deficit is being put?
Can I say both?
Yeah.
Look, I think there's a number of issues in that zone. So the first, I would call it a fun fact, but it's not fun at all, that I would give credit to the CRFP for is the calculation that 55% of our $1 trillion deficit in the next fiscal year is all a result of things that were enacted in the last 3 years. The 2015 legislation that dealt with a lot of the gimmicks and extenders and things like that, the tax cut, and then the spending bill, which personally I think was very hard to justify. And so if we hadn't done those three things, admittedly we had to do something about the extenders and the gimmicks, but if we hadn't done those three things, instead of a $1 trillion deficit, we'd be looking at a $450 billion deficit for the next fiscal year. So I think that as a whole was a set of pretty irresponsible policy actions. I agree with Deanna that the corporate tax code needed to be fixed. We were uncompetitive. Whether it needed to go all the way to 21% or not, I think reasonable people could probably debate, but we needed to do something. I think the personal tax cuts, particularly the regressive nature of them, is very hard to defend. Something like, I'm doing this from memory because this wasn't what I came to exactly to talk about, something like 85% of this tax cut is going to either business or people making more than $75,000 a year, and I don't think that's exactly how we should be running it. We were talking in the green room about the fact, and there are reasons why it made sense to do this, but nonetheless, it does seem a little unfair. The business tax cuts are permanent. The individual tax cuts expire. So there's a lot of issues within that. On the spending side, I would agree with Deanna and say another side of the coin, but the same general point, that we've got our priorities pretty screwed up. And entitlements, we all know, need to be dealt with. Neither party wants to deal with it. Here's another fun fact for you. I think I'm right in saying that in the State of the Union this year, there was not, the words debt and deficit were never mentioned, not once. And so we've still got this entitlements problem. We have the interest problem that Deanna talked about, and the result, as all of you guys well know, is that we're squeezing out everything else. And so spending on infrastructure, spending on R&D as a percent of GDP have gone down by 50% since we started getting into this mode. And we're kind of eating our seed corn, and that is a really bad place to be.
So I bring up the nature of the deficit because the theory of the case of the administration, if you listen to them, is that, yes, we're running some temporary deficits, but we did it to basically spur more investment by lowering the cost of capital by companies. And lo and behold, 10 years from now, they claim this tax cut will have paid for itself. So stop worrying. What's your reaction to that?
Are you asking me?
Yeah, sure, yeah.
So, look, the administration says that if we get 0.4% of additional GDP growth, it pays for itself. There is not one other forecaster from any end of the political spectrum and the ones in the middle who believe that. The IMF actually thinks it's a negative on growth because of what it does to the amount of debt that we have. If you look at Goldman Sachs, if you look at the CBO, if you look at the CRFB, you look at anybody, it's a rounding error. It's a few tenths of a basis point. And so the answer is conventional wisdom can always be wrong, but the vast preponderance of conventional wisdom is it will not pay for itself.
Simon, from the economist's point of view, the debt we've taken on for these particular policy initiatives, 10 years from now, do they make us richer or poorer than we otherwise would be?
Well, that depends, Greg, as I said, on the world economy and on the appetite for American debt. What I can say is, because I work with a lot of people at MIT who are starting companies who want to invest in the United States, they were enthusiastic about the United States before this tax cut. Sorry, I missed the bit about the reform. I saw your tax cut. Before the tax cut, that they were enthusiastic about the US. We were one of the best places in the world to do business. And this is people banging down my door, our doors at MIT, every day to invest in new technology, innovation, artificial intelligence, robotics, whatever you want to put out there.
You're talking about before the tax?
Yeah, absolutely. Before people were enthusiastic.
Can I let you finish and then disagree?
Yes, of course.
Okay.
Now they're also enthusiastic, so that's good. I'm very positive, and I'm trying to help people, so that's good. America has extremely good fundamentals. What I think we're talking about here is a sword hanging over the recovery. If the world turns against us, and maybe it's for reasons beyond our control, we have handed our fate to these global capital markets and to the appetite of other countries for our government debt. We didn't used to do this. We didn't have to do this. I think Steve put his finger on it. Just in terms of the cycle, if you have a big recession, automatic stabilizers kick in, you're going to have a bigger deficit, more debt. That's okay as long as at the top of the cycle you go the other way. That's counter-cyclical fiscal policy. I think the worry today, Greg, go back to your original question, is we have manifestly demonstrated, and just had a good demonstration in the first session this morning, that there is no political will to run proper counter-cyclical fiscal policy in this country. That's very scary, because that, over time, adds up to a much more dangerous position for us.
I don't disagree, Simon, that the U.S. has been historically and was before this tax bill an attractive place to invest. But as someone who makes a living dealing with companies, investments, and financial things, I would say that the way the corporate tax code worked created terribly perverse incentives, gave enormous incentives to companies to invert themselves. We all know about the inversions, and relocate out of this country, moving certainly profits, if not jobs, out of this country. The whole game of transfer pricing, where companies effectively got profits to exist in countries with the lowest possible tax rates, minimized their tax burden there, didn't pay any taxes here, kept the money offshore, was a terrible practice. We were really, I think, heading in a bad direction. And again, I think we could argue about the magnitude of the decrease. We could argue about whether other ways to make the numbers work better, so we weren't talking about as large of a tax cut. But I do think we were right to do something about the corporate tax code.
Can I put a historical perspective on this? If you look back to the times when this country has run big deficits in the past, and we have, times of war, times of recession, depression, we've typically paid that deficit back down within 10 years. But if you look at all the reasons for running those big deficits in the past, there's been an element of the American people were willing to sacrifice for whatever it was we're paying for, to win a war, to get ourselves out of recession. And the political will to pay back within 5 to 10 years was typically there. I think it's difficult today for the American people to understand why we're in the deficit position we're in. I mean, we see this with our clients. They're like, well, what are we paying for? You're asking us to sacrifice to pay back the debt. It's not necessarily a war or a deep recession, or if they think it's because of the 2008 recession, then they have a hard time understanding who's accountable. So I think, to the representatives in the room and those who are on the panel this morning, if we're going to put them in a position to get the American people to sacrifice to pay this back, because it will be a sacrifice, there's no magic way out of this, we have to make it clear to people what they're paying for. And I think it's difficult in this position versus where it was in the 40s or other times where we've used a lot of deficit financing.
I want to stay with you for a moment, Deanna, because unfortunately you are the representative of the American business
of all
here.
Business, yes.
So you bear all the responsibilities for But the business community obviously was very enthusiastic about this tax bill. They generally talked a lot about how they wanted the tax bill to pass. They did not talk a lot about the debt consequences of it. Was that a mistake? And what is the responsibility of businesses to say and do going forward to correct that?
Well, you're right, Greg. In the past, we've heard CEOs, and I've been one of them, talk a lot about the debt is a problem. And I think most CEOs still believe that. But to Steve's point, there really was a reason to pass this tax bill. And there were a lot of negative things that were happening for the economy because of the lack of competitiveness with other countries on the corporate tax bill. So although I don't speak for all CEOs, I would say that generally this opportunity to either reform or reduce corporate taxes, however you want to say it, doesn't come along that often. And so it was an opportunity for CEOs to be supportive of something that needed to happen, even though there were potentially negative consequences for the deficit. But I think you'll see CEOs coming back to, okay, now we have to get back to figuring out what do we do about running such a huge deficit, because it is going to have an impact at some time in the future. I think part of the difficulty is we don't know when, right? To Steve's point earlier, this could go on for a long time. And so if you can't say to people, we need to cut spending on this, this, and this that is going to impact you socially, or we're going to have to increase tax rates, if you can't tell them why, and you're a representative in Congress, it's pretty difficult to vote for it.
Yes,
so I talk to a lot of CEOs too, Greg, mostly entrepreneurs and people who want to become entrepreneurs. So new capital, the next generation, they are very worried about the debt and very worried in the context of this key problem that we haven't yet mentioned this morning, healthcare spending. So, and not just government-funded healthcare spending, but healthcare spending in general. So when you're starting a company and you're looking 10, 20, 30 years down the road, what you're going to build, these are very real issues for those CEOs. And with all due respect to Steve, I think he made a brilliant case for corporate tax reform. Lower the rates, broaden the base. We heard that plenty going into this. I don't think we got that kind of reform. I think what we got was a tax cut and larger deficits. So how are we going to pay for healthcare spending going forward?
So
I was going to say, Simon, you were right to correct me on that. That is exactly right. And I don't remember these numbers. Maybe somebody else does. But the share of federal revenue that comes from the corporate side has been declining steadily for a very long time. And I would say to Deanna, I was thinking about this as you were speaking, I think it's fine for business to advocate for corporate tax reform for all the reasons that you and I both agree on. But they also are advocating for all kinds of other tax changes that happen to suit their own company, their own industry. And they got a lot of them. And it would have been nice if business had said, okay, I want this rate cut. So I'm agreeing with you, Simon. I got this rate cut, but in return, I don't need immediate depreciation. That really doesn't actually help that much. Or I don't need this and all these loopholes that could be closed. And we did very little, if any, of that.
So the administration will say, this administration and this Congress will say, we agree the deficit needs to be dealt with, but it needs to be fixed with spending. Spending's the problem. Do you agree? Can we fix this on the spending side alone? Simon?
Look, as I just brought up healthcare spending.
Sure.
So I think if we're looking out the medium term, so beyond actually the forecast horizon of the Congressional Budget Office, but absolutely within the forecast horizon of everybody in this room, including, thank goodness, the Peterson Foundation, healthcare spending looms very large. And no, we cannot turn around the fiscal ship unless we get a control on healthcare spending relative to GDP. But it's healthcare spending, because if you just push it off the government accounts onto the private sector, onto individuals, onto companies, that will ruin the economy. That will really undermine our competitiveness. So we need to have a proper conversation about why we spend so much on healthcare, how we can change that spending going forward and limit it relative to GDP. That is the spending route out of our medium-term fiscal and overall economic issues.
I agree that healthcare spending is very important, and we are somewhat in the healthcare business. One of the things we're very concerned about is there are 40 million Americans right now in the gig economy, so to speak, who aren't covered by their employer in terms of healthcare. They may or may not be on some government subsidized plan, and we need to have a way for them to be insured at a reasonable rate. So we've been recently introducing some products with groups like Freelancers Union that give, very, I would say, stripped down but useful healthcare benefits at a price they can afford. And I do think we're going to need some more private sector solutions around healthcare. We can't expect the government to do all of this. We can't expect corporations to do all this, because one thing that's true with I think the new generation coming up is a lot of them do want to be entrepreneurs, right? They do work in the gig economy, and we don't really have a structural way to deal with healthcare spending for them at this point.
So let me, I want to just answer your question. The answer is no. This can't all be done. I don't believe this can all be done on the spending side, and I don't believe it should be. That when you look at the long-term percent of tax revenue as a percent of GDP, I think it's around 19% in terms of where we are now, which is below our historical average, certainly below higher places we've been in the past. And I think when you're facing an aging society and all the costs that we all know are coming, I don't think it's realistic to be cutting total tax revenues to the lowest level they've been in a very long time while you're trying to deal with these challenges. That said, I certainly recognize we have to deal with healthcare spending, but I think we all have to be honest about what we're talking about, which is it's a huge moral issue. We have a system now that essentially says to people who qualify for Medicare or whatever, you can more or less, there are processes, but you can more or less get whatever health care you need or want. And as we enter this world of drugs that cost $100,000 a month or numbers like that for relatively limited potential outcomes and so on, we're going to face real tough decisions about how much money we want to allocate to healthcare and how we're going to allocate it. And is everybody entitled essentially to whatever they think they need and whenever they think they need it, regardless of the likely outcome for them? And Britain does that. There's a lot of criticism around it, a lot of unhappiness in Britain around it, but they've done it. And I think we're going to face some of those same choices.
We're also going to need to look at retirement spending, although it's not as big as healthcare spending, and find ways for Americans to help themselves save for retirement and not depend entirely on the government. Today, as thinking about my industry, the insurance industry, we pay out about $1.7 billion a day in benefit, which is almost 3/4 the amount that Social Security pays out in benefit every day. And I'm not sure that people realize that the insurance industry is, approaching the size of Social Security. But that's private, and we need more private solutions because we can't have the Social Security continue to grow and private shrink. But in order to do that, we need to educate people about what they're really facing in retirement and what they can do about it today.
Well, and in that context, it's not just limiting immigration going forward, we're evicting people from this country. So if you think about what funds Social Security and what keeps the fiscal bears from the door, sorry about the Russian allusion there, it was accidental, then it's population and it's young people and it's people working, people paying in. And if you're kicking them out of the country and not letting them become legal and not letting them pay in, that is just going to exacerbate, worsen, and accelerate the problems that you're talking about.
In 2012, Paul Ryan was vice presidential candidate, and they ran on a ticket trying to point out that the cost of entitlements for the elderly was a looming fiscal problem. And he had all sorts of ideas for dealing with this, from privatizing Social Security to Medicare vouchers, raising retirement age. Well, we know what happened. He lost that election, and then Donald Trump became president by promising not to do any of those things. And Paul Ryan is now riding off into the sunset in a few months' time. And so what did we learn from that? I mean, politically, everybody on this panel says, yes, we have to do healthcare, we have to do Social Security. Haven't we learned that that just is not a non-starter, and therefore something else is going to have to take the weight?
Look, I think what is most dispiriting about this whole situation, probably to many of the people in this room, is the fact that people have become inured to these deficits and the debt, and they don't seem to either understand it or care or think it's important or think it matters. And so I think that those of us who are in, not all of us and not the people in this room actually, who are in a position of some influence or responsibility are kind of being irresponsible in not dealing with this and in basically saying it's so much easier to kick the can down the road, it's so much easier to have tax cuts, it's so much easier to throw on another $1.5 trillion, $1.2 trillion of spending. And look, at the bottom line, what I think is, of all the bad things that are happening around this, what I find the most depressing, the most dispiriting, is the fact that is the intergenerational aspect of this, that we are creating an enormous debt burden that is going to end up limiting what our children are able to do and what our government is able to do for our children. I'm not saying, I'm not some crazy fiscal hawk that says, it's all going to have to get paid off and we're going to have to deal with that. We don't have to pay it off, but it's going to limit our degrees of freedom, it's going to limit our degrees of movement, and it's going to force other cutbacks eventually, whether or not there's a credit crisis. And the fact that the country, you made a reference to, I think, to World War II, and I don't, Simon, you would remember, debt to GDP was well over 100% at the end of World War II.
160.
And we basically got it to zero. We made the tough choices. We did what we had to do. We got it essentially to zero, and now nobody seems to care.
Well, actually, the choices to those people were not so tough, because if you have growth and if you keep your spending under control and if you're responsible on the revenue side, you can grow out of it. And I would remind everyone that our debt to GDP, which people worried about before the crisis of 2008, was about 40% of GDP. So we've doubled it. We've used up our fiscal space. In 2023, if you look at the IMF medium-term forecast, I think it's about as far out as you can reasonably look, we will be number 3 among all advanced countries in terms of debt to GDP. Number 1, Japan. Number 2, Greece. Actually, we'll be 3rd equal. Good news, sorry. Italy and us will have the same level of debt to GDP. And that's before we come to grips with, you're right, these are difficult problems. So Steve's point was, I absolutely agree with this, it's completely unnecessary for us to have got to this point. Even 5 years ago, we could have found, or even 2 years ago, even a year ago, we could have put ourselves on a different fiscal path. And I think that's why this year is worrying, Greg, because we have clearly and resolutely stepped down a difficult path that is just going to make all of these future problems that we agree on much harder to deal with.
But getting back to why it's so difficult to do this now, think about the national debt clock. Those of us from New York are familiar with the national debt clock. Has been running since 1989. And the public sees that and they say, oh, it's been running for a long time and nothing has happened. I think to Steve's earlier point, the longer this goes on without some sort of market impact that's going to spur some reaction in the general public, the harder it is. Because they don't really see the immediate result to them of running this kind of debt.
There was a national debt clock in the House Financial Services Committee room. I watched it tick up many times. I was there during the Obama administration. Last time I was there, during the Trump administration, it wasn't working.
Figuratively and literally. But just to sort of push back on that a little bit, a lot of folks have pointed out that, like in the depths of the crisis, a lot of these fiscal hawks were out there screaming about the worries and forcing austerity on countries like Greece, like the United States, when the economy really needed more stimulus. And they have argued, correct, I think, with some evidence, that a country like the United States, which doesn't just issue its own currency, but issues the most valuable reserve currency in the world, has virtually, essentially a blank check to borrow as much as it wants. And if anything, what we've seen over the last 5 years is a desperate desire by lenders to get a hold of some of our treasury bills, these so-called safe assets. So among respectable economists, there is a real debate about whether the kinds of scenarios you're painting are the ones we need to worry about. So what's your perspective on that debate?
Look, there's a good argument that the U.S. has had in the past enough fiscal space to use effective counter-cyclical fiscal policy, and maybe we could have done more earlier in the recession, right? People will argue about that, no doubt, for decades to come. We're at or close to full employment. We have a low rate of unemployment. There are very few people who are arguing we should be expanding fiscally at this point in time. How much fiscal space do we have? What debt to GDP could we sustainably run? It's a great question. You don't know, because it's out of your control. It's in the hands of the global capital markets. It's subject to the whims of governments and private sector and all kinds of our own trade policy perhaps will play a role, the pressure we put on countries. If you force China and other countries to a lower current account surplus quicker, that's less capital for them to invest in global markets, including with the private sector, including with the public sector. So I don't know, Greg, how much we could safely borrow. I don't think it's wise to push it as hard as you can. Yeah. And as Steve said, we've had very reasonable choice points in the last few months even, where we've chosen to take the more irresponsible, more reckless course of action. That is a concern.
Look, I'd be willing to stipulate, just for the sake of discussion, that we do have the ultimate reserve currency, that we have enormous fiscal space, that we can borrow what we want for as long as we want, that even though many of us worry about the possibility of a capital markets revolt, it's possible there won't be one, as I said at the very beginning. But none of that, not one part of that changes a couple of the fundamental points I think that a number of us have tried to make today. One is the intergenerational transfer aspect of this, and two is the misplaced priorities that it's creating on the spending side and to some degree on the revenue side in terms of how we are running our fiscal policy. And I would just say one other thing that occurred to me earlier, that we came reasonably close actually to making a good start on solving this problem with Simpson-Bowles. But for a couple of votes on that committee, we might have put that in place. Instead, we went into sequestration, which is like creating a pressure cooker and trying to hold it together, and then eventually, as it did last year, it explodes and all the spending kind of comes pouring out. But there were moments in time where it felt like we actually might pull ourselves together and do something. And now, as I said earlier, it feels to me like outside of the people in this room and a few others, nobody knows, nobody cares, nobody's as worried as the rest of us.
I think one thing we should think about, yes, we are the reserve currency, and hopefully we will be for a long time, but do we really want to hand that power over to other countries? It might not happen today, it might not happen 10, 20, 30 years from now, but eventually, maybe we wouldn't be the reserve currency. Do we really want to be in that situation? Even though it's very remote, and I'm certainly not an alarmist on this, do we really want to hand over our future to other countries in terms of their willingness to invest in our debt?
And I might add that this comes at a time when the current administration has adopted a very confrontational approach with other countries, many of these same countries from which we were borrowing, both with respect to trade, and we saw it this week with respect to sanctions in Iran. Do you believe that particular posture in terms of trade and foreign affairs also elevates some of the risks that we've been discussing?
Yeah, absolutely, because we've handed our fate on the economic side over to the global capital markets, and for political reasons, we're trying to create various pressures that make people less inclined to invest with us. You don't have to lose the reserve currency status in order to face significantly higher interest rates in the 10-year bond market, for example. Those things are completely consistent. And the way that the official consensus squares the circle right now, the capital because they have large U.S. deficits going forward, they have a relatively benign economic forecast, the capital account surpluses that finance that come primarily from Europe. Now, if the Europeans are next in line to be overly generous lenders to us, I wish we used the capital better, more for investment and more for public investment in education and research and development, as Steve said. But perhaps we shouldn't complain too much. However, if the Germans change their fiscal policy or if the overall economic position of Europe changes, then you're out of luck. Your long-term rates are going to go up just because investment preferences around the world outside the United States changed.
Did you want to add something?
No, I would look. I don't want to sound too sanguine about the capital markets and too blasé. Oh, yeah, it's all fine. It's 20 basis points, whatever. I do think, for the reasons Simon and Deanna said, I do think there's too high a possibility, even if it's not a probability. It's too scary to have even a reasonable possibility of the capital markets revolting. And right now the Treasury has been borrowing mostly very short term. And so it hasn't had that much of an effect on the market. But as these deficits rise into the next fiscal year and cross the $1 trillion mark again, the Treasury is going to be in the market. and they're going to have to borrow some longer-term money, and that is going to put pressure on rates. We were talking about mortgages just before we came on here. It's going to put pressure on the average American. And as Deanna, I think, implicitly or explicitly said, it's going to put pressure on the government itself, because as they borrow longer, as rates go up, it simply raises, in addition to the amount of total debt creating more interest, the rates on the interest go up, and that exacerbates the deficit problem, and you get into a spiral, a very bad spiral.
Yeah, Simon, I just wanted to remembering, I was glad you brought up the 1968 analogy earlier, because if you go back in history, like the late 1960s, the initial period did seem like Goldilocks. We had low inflation, low interest rates, balanced budget. The US economy was on top of the world. Within 5 years, all that had changed. Inflation was rising towards 4%. Interest rates were skyrocketing. The US was going into deficit. Nixon closed the gold window. We were into the 70s with a period of chaotic economic conditions. Now, history never repeats, but it does rhyme. So these are certain things to keep in mind. I started my career in Canada in the early 1990s at a period when Canada was facing very large fiscal deficits, mounting debt, was very much in the bad books of the global community. The dollar was under pressure. And what I take away from that episode is that Canada never faced a crisis in an Argentina sense of the word. Canada never lost access to the world's financial markets. But what did happen was that, as I think, Deanna, you were saying, each year the Canadians were handing more and more money over to their creditors, and this was squeezing out everything else. And I'll never forget somebody in the government telling me, it is like every year we take a third of all the tax we raise and we throw it on the fireplace. And that was a political dynamic that couldn't last. So in terms of looking forward, Simpson-Bowles, obviously we talk a lot about how great it would have been if its recommendations had been followed. Is another Simpson-Bowles the solution, and how likely is it to fare better this time than it did the last time? Deanna?
Well, I think the panel previous to ours was having that discussion, and they were bemoaning the fact that Simpson-Bowles didn't work, and talked about how close it was and how close we were in Congress potentially to striking a grand bargain not so long ago. So I would like to be hopeful that there's a potential that we could do that again. And I think what can we all do as citizens to help is, provide support for that to our representatives in Congress, and make sure that we say, hey, this is a priority for us, and we're going to stand with you even if you have to do some things that are a little unpopular, because it's more important to come to this kind of agreement about what we're going to do about the debt.
I think that as we talk about solutions, the idea about basically whose ox gets gored, who has to pay the sacrifice, comes up, and then issues of equity come up. As in the current debate, there's a lot of discussion about, well, we're going to fix the spending problem with like work requirements for Medicaid and food stamps. We're going to do rescissions. Number one, in terms of numbers, is that good enough? Number two, what does that say about the notion of shared sacrifice? Is that going to cut it politically across all voting groups?
Look, I think first, I don't want to rain on the parade or ruin the parade or whatever, but I'm just so pessimistic at the moment about the prospect of the country coming together and somehow addressing this problem. I just see right this second as we sit here, very regrettably, you just have to be honest about it, just so little emphasis, discussion, interest, whatever, in addressing this problem, that the idea of another Simpson-Bowles or the idea of a Dayton off-campus summit or any of these different ideas that are floating around, it's just so hard to imagine that there is the political will or the public pressure right this second to do it. I wish there were. I wish I had better news. I wish I had a better idea for how to accomplish it. But I just feel like we're at the wrong end of the pendulum in a way on this issue for whatever set of reasons at the moment. But I certainly agree, Greg, to your question that when and if the moment comes, or there seems to be any prospect of addressing it, it obviously has to be shared sacrifice, and everybody has to come to the table. And one of my issues with the last two rounds of tax cuts and spending increases is I don't think it was shared. And I don't think you mentioned the rescission package. That's obviously a rounding error in the great scheme of things, but that's not shared sacrifice, that rescissions package that they're talking about. That's directed at one class of Americans.
Yeah, I think the political dynamic, Greg, is going very strongly the other way. The next decision that we can see coming is the decision whether or not to extend, or whether or not to repeal or allow to expire the personal tax cuts. So there's going to be a big discussion around that. I was in favor of not extending the Bush-era tax cuts, and people on that side of the argument completely lost. So I think that in this period of delegitimization, of a lot of the burden having been placed on some lower-income Americans and people not at the top, I think it's very hard to get people together unless and until upper-income Americans are willing to have, frankly, higher tax rates. And I see no inclination on their part to head in that direction, and that has had a big repercussions across the political spectrum.
Deanna, do you have any thoughts on that?
I think the idea of shared sacrifice, as both of my fellow panelists here said, it's absolutely necessary. We're going to have shared sacrifice in order to solve this problem. As a human being, I think, trying to balance this on the backs of the people who have the least makes absolutely no sense, and it makes no political sense, right? And I do agree that people at the upper end of the spectrum are going to have to be willing to sacrifice more. And I think I've heard my two fellow panelists say that this latest round of tax cuts that did cut for upper income Americans, my accountant called me and said, good news, you're going to be paying less tax. And I have to say, I had a pit in my stomach. That isn't what I wanted. I wanted corporate tax reform. I don't need to pay less. I want the national debt to be solved.
I just mention one other aspect of this tax cut that is not widely appreciated is that it was regressive on the personal side, and it was also regressive in a way on the corporate side because it had a very positive impact on stocks, which is good. We want stocks to be higher. But stocks are vastly disproportionately owned by the wealthy. And so actually my taxes, as a matter of fact, went up because I live in New York, and so I lost my state, I'm going to lose my state and local deduction. But quite frankly, what happened to me on the investment side, because of the way it inflated stock prices, way outweighed that. So I frankly got a much larger tax cut or benefit out of this tax package, if you want to put it that way, than I deserve.
So we have just a couple of minutes left. I'd like to actually get everybody into the prognostication game right now. And we've talked a lot about the discouraging lack of political consensus or will to deal with the debt. So I'd like you all to sort of offer a prediction about what will change the political will and whether it will happen in the next 4 years, starting with you, Simon.
Well, my late great colleague Mike Musser always said, never predict a number and a date in the same prediction. So
if Mike were here, I wouldn't let him get away with that.
Right. What changes it? Look, if there's some external pressure, if interest rates go up, that seems like the most likely spark. But the more let me be gentle with that, we make the world unstable, the more people look for safe havens, the more actually they come to Steve's store and to Deanna's store, and they buy, corporate debt or stocks or maybe government debt. So we are making the safe haven more valuable at the same time as we're storing up these longer-term problems, I think, in the international foreign relations side and on the economic side. So do I see it happening in the next 4 years? No, I don't actually.
Deanna, what will change and when?
Well, I'd like to think that we could collectively make this a priority and make this an issue with our clients and our employees and bring this to the forefront. It may have to be a crisis. I hope it doesn't come to that, but it may have to be.
Steve?
My former penultimate supervisor when I was in the Obama administration, Rahm Emanuel, very famously said, never let a crisis go to waste. And I would say that I think that's what it will take. And hopefully we won't let it go to waste, but I think that we're going to need some kind of motivating factor, motivating principle to get people off of their corners and where they are now.
And what's the probability that that happens in the next 4 years, percentage-wise?
I don't know, Simon, you've got a good quick line for me to get out of answering that question.
I think we're out of time.
I think it's, we're out of time.
Can I have another minute?
Look, I think it's well less than 50%. I think it's 25, 30%, something like that.
Fair enough. All right. Thanks very much. Great discussion. Appreciate it. And thank you for listening.